Hello, my name is James and welcome to the TGITFH podcast. Today I'm going to be talking about how we communicate with our devices, such as the interfaces and software. I'll be looking at graphical interface and discuss how the design of technology has changed, and then I'll be debating whether or not computers and digital devices could be considered as art. Would you hang a phone in an art gallery and call it a piece of contemporary art? Get in the loop with us here on Twitter at TGITFH or over on our Facebook page, facebook.com/TheGuyInTheFunnyArtsOfficial. So how do we interact with our devices? There are two main ways we communicate with our smartphones, our computers, and our tablets, or whatever we use. There's the hardware side and the software side. The hardware side consists of buttons, switches possibly, scroll wheels, joysticks, and touchscreens. Touchscreens are the physical hardware behind what you would have on a touch device. Then in the back end we have software which translates this input, and it translates it to an output and a response. And the graphical user interfaces, or the GUIs, or the software or the interface could have various virtual switches, virtual buttons, icons, menus, sub-menus, directories, all this crazy stuff going on inside it. When you look at it, it's very, very complex how software really works. And we have the option of having different peripherals. We can plug in different things like cameras, we can plug in microphones and keyboards and mice, or touchscreens. Some desktops have touchscreens now that you can interact with your desktop with. And I think this has really only come into fruition within the past 10 years or so, when we've really started to customize the way we interact with our computers, especially with things like voice recognition. You know, if you've got OK Google, is it called, on Android, and you've got Cortana and Siri on Windows and iOS. And we started to interact with our computers using our voice, apart from just touch and apart from just normal methods. And I think that's pretty cool. And I think it's really emphasizing on this whole customization thing. People are really, especially developers, they're really pushing new ways of interacting. Now we've got virtual reality, and we've got new 3D touch technology where you can put things on your phone and it can tell you how much it weighs or whatever, which is quite a cool little thing. But customization doesn't just come from the hardware side. We also now have seen a great influx in people who want to customize their software. Now, this used to be on things like Windows XP and later on up to Windows 7. And it sort of died off with Windows 8.1 and Windows 10, I believe. But one place it never died off, and it never will die off, is the Linux community. If you ever search Linux desktop into Google Images, you'll see some very crazy things. I saw some really nice ones on Google Plus, because I use Google Plus quite a lot for my tech news and, you know, gadget reviews and stuff, because it comes up from Google search engine. It's all very well optimized for Google, so it works really well. And I was browsing through, and there was this picture, and it was someone's desktop, and you wouldn't think it was someone's desktop. It was a wallpaper of a heart, which was drawn in like ink, with ink splodges here and there, and it had what's called Conky, CONKY, which is a desktop widget on Linux. I think you can get it on Mac OS X as well, and it gives you things like readouts of what your computer's doing, you know, the processor speed, gives you a clock widget or a calendar or whatever. And they had that, and they had in the side, on the left-hand panel, they had like a dock, which had all these icons, all flat black icons. Everything was flat, everything was black, everything was clean and minimalist, and it was absolutely stunning to look at. And yet that was someone's computer. That was so that someone would sit and write Word documents or use the internet and browse Facebook on that machine. That is how they worked with their computer. And I just thought that was absolutely incredible. And then as you go through, you see some more interesting designs that other people have done. I've seen ones where they have like mountains, and they've got the clock on top of the mountain or embedded in the mountain, and then they've got no desktop icons, no taskbar or anything. It's just like a side panel or a bottom panel for everything. It's absolutely insane. You know, there's no real taskbars as you get in Windows. It's just you get a dock or whatever to control everything through. Or some of them don't even have that. Some of them just have a wallpaper that they've designed themselves. It's just a picture, and you interact with the computer by simply right-clicking on the desktop and going down to your applications. I know I can do that on mine. If I right-click on my desktop, I have an option for my applications, and it brings up all the applications that I've installed onto my laptop, which is quite cool and quite useful. But tweaking on a computer, when it comes to Windows 8, Windows 10, and OS X, it's not as good. I mean, OS X, you can change icons and stuff quite easily. It's the same really with Windows as well. There are some theme packs you can get, but they're very few and far between, and they don't work very well. They don't, from my own experience, they're never, ever very good. They're very stripped back and basic, and they can only offer so much. But I think customization has really died off on them, but it's really still heavy on Linux, especially on Android. People now customize ROMs to the extent where they're completely unrecognizable. If you look at stock Android and then look at the Samsung ROMs, they are completely different from one another. They work completely different. Now, of course, some would argue, this causes problems for IT, but often or not, if you just know how your system works, much like we do on Linux, you can fix any problem through a couple of simple executions. On Linux, you just basically work in the terminal, and you can do that in Android. The problem is that it's not for... See, Android's for everyone, and for Android to do that, it'd be very difficult for people. Like, if you had a small bug and you need to fix it, it's better just to take it to a shop, really, and get it fixed, than fix it yourself. Customization has come a long way with things like custom ROMs, and you can now get custom launchers for your Android phones, and that's coming into fruition now. People are really starting to design them better and get a much more stock or much more cleaner Android experience out. So yeah, let me know what customization and what tweaks you've made to your systems. Do you go hell for leather on them, or do you just keep it stock? Let me know on Twitter at TGITFH. Remember that hashtag Orange Army. So moving on to the graphical user interface and how it's adapted over the years. If we look back before graphical user interfaces were even a thing, which is a very, very long time ago, you'll see what was known as a terminal environment, or what we now call a terminal environment. Back then it was just your normal computer. You'd be presented with a black screen with some text written in grey. And this was how you used your computer. You would type out every command. If you wanted to launch a program, nowadays we just tap an icon and it does it. However, on these computers, you would have to write out the instructions in order to execute that program. So if you wanted to run it in administrator mode, you'd have to put that into the arguments, what are known as arguments. And, before GUIs came along, computers were very much usable. They were just a lot harder than they are now to use and to understand. In fact, there's a lot of videos on the internet of people who take old computers and attempt to use them. And I actually remember a computer I used to have where I used to have to put in a floppy disk just to boot it up. And yeah, it was a bit of a ball ache. It used to make the most horrendous noise when you put the floppy disk in. The terminal environment was quite difficult to use compared to what we have now. I think computers have become dumbed down. But if we go back to 2001, when the graphical interface became a lot more important in an operating system, this is when OS X Tiger started to really come out and Windows XP was born. If you look at Windows XP and if you look at OS X, they share some very good similarities. They both have blue accents, so a lot of things on the screen are blue. I don't know why everything was blue back then, but it just was. Everything was blue. They also had a lot of bulging here and there. So like the start button on Windows looked very bulged out. The traffic light buttons, which are the exit, minimize and maximize buttons on a Mac, they looked like they were bulging out the screen. Everything looked artificially 3D and also as if it was drawn by a child. Although they were both colourful and vibrant with lots of blue, lots of bright shiny colours, they were very matte in their appearance. So Windows XP had a matte taskbar and a matte start button which would glow slightly when you put your mouse over it. And OS X also had very matte icons until later releases when they started to go more glossy. And this became a theme, actually. After the matte look of Windows XP and the first OS X's, then came the rise of things like Vista and 7 and also OS X, is it Mountain Lion or whatever, where they started to have this gloss appearance to them. Everything started to look glossy as if there was a pane of glass over the top of it. It was, to be honest, tacky. I really wasn't a fan of it. And although the colours were still there somewhat, and it stayed that way up until the end of Windows 7's life. Windows 7 was the start of the flat world when we started to go flat. Between this time, iOS and Android was born. iOS and Android started with the glossy appeal. So if you remember the first iOS interface, everything was glossy. Everything looked like it was made of glass. Very shiny. And the same with Android, actually. Android was very shiny and very glossy. There's still a lot of apps that you can get in the App Store which show glossy icons. And another thing is that after these were born, we started to shift over from the glossiness slowly towards a flat environment. And now, nearly every single operating system on the planet that is modern, released within the past 2 or 3 years, is completely flat when I'm not hitting my microphone stand. If you look at modern Android, the Android lollipops and KitKat to some extent, it was very flat. Everything went flat and minimalistic. If you look at the latest iOS, which is like iOS 9, I think it is. No, iOS 8 and 9. Even if you look at iOS 7, they're very flat. If you look at Windows 8, 8.1 and Windows 10, they're all flat. However, one thing they do have, they tend to all have this great big emphasis on 3D effects. They all want things bulging out. If you remember Windows 7, you had this thing where it was in Vista as well, where you could cycle through all the running programs that were open in 3D. And that was really what it was like. You tap this button, I think it was Alt-Tab or Shift-Tab or Control-Tab, something like that, some combination of that. And instead of bringing up your normal little window where you can cycle through your things, it will bring up a 3D pane. Now, this hasn't died. This has been reborn in quite a few operating systems. Android uses it still. They now use it pretty much for their task manager, so you can switch tasks. iOS has it, but the only one that's really done it like Windows Vista did is Ubuntu. They released a mobile operating system, and now that works in a similar way to it with it. So you pull from the right, you slowly drag in, and you get this 3D tiled thing, and you can cycle through your windows. It's all very intuitive, very interesting, very abstract and bizarre. It uses a lot of gesturing. But it makes using your phone a lot quicker than it would be normally. Instead of tapping buttons, it's a lot easier just to do a quick gesture and flip through things. And I think, this has become the new trend, this whole emphasis on 3D effects. Whether our effects are going to be 2D or not, everything's gone 3D. I remember when Windows 8.1 was out and the tiles were very 2D, everything sort of paned up and down as if it was a slideshow. But now, it all sort of moves in 3D and switches as if the tiles are boxes. It's quite surreal. Android does it as well. When you tap an icon, it does a 3D effect. And iOS sort of has it. It more does it with a depth thing on iOS. But that too has some 3D effects to it. But one thing that really hasn't done what the mainstream has done is Linux, and it's because it's so fragmented, because there's so many distributions of it, there's so many changes. Although, yes, a lot of people have flat icons on Linux, the defaults aren't. The defaults are very old school Mac. I've got some. I use the elementary icons, the latest ones, and they remind me a hell of a lot of like an old Mac, like an old iMac. They look slightly, ever so slightly 3D, a bit bulgy, very simple, very matte, very plain, but they're still minimalist, but they're not flat. They're slightly rounded, each one. And it looks quite fun and childlike. But then again, if you compare it to the older computers, it has matured. Our graphical user interfaces mean a lot. And I know people who don't like or do not want to get Windows 8.1. I know people who prefer Windows 10. I know people who prefer Windows 8. I know people who prefer neither. More developers should give the opportunity to change up the environment. I mean, look at what happened to Windows 8. They completely changed the desktop. They got rid of the start button. They made a new tile system called Metro. When it was released, a lot of people went online and started slagging it off and insulting it and saying this was one of the worst operating systems ever made. After a while, people started to change it up, and there were programs that were released. Okay, they cost money, which is a bit of a bummer, but, people could download these things that would change the appearance of it and fix the problems that they were having. But I think they should go the way that Linux has done. I think you should be given the option, and I know Windows has. Windows 10, if you press, I think it used to be Control-C, it's not, that's now Cortana. I'm actually not sure what it is. I think it's the notification panel. Yes, it is. You can enter a mode called tablet mode. I've got this up on my desktop, so I'm using it. And that will change the way your computer works from a standard desktop interface to one that's very reminiscent of Android or something like that. So you have your Windows start button thing like you had in Windows 8 back, which I really am not a fan of, and I prefer the desktop mode. They changed it all, they listened to people's cries, and the OS X has done something similar, not quite, where you can change from a light theme to a dark theme. Now, you're probably thinking, well, how is that the same? Well, Macs are built for video editing and photo editing and very much media production. So to have an option to black everything out, believe it or not, is one of the best moves Apple could have done, because Linux has had this for ages and they're not even good with media. But a lot of the programs on Linux that use things like video and photos all have the option of having a dark theme. And the reason you have a dark theme is because it's less distracting than a bright theme. It's not glaring in your face, and you can focus more on the screen or the work that you're doing, and the colours stand out more against the black background. But yeah, I'm going to move on from that. Let me know, do you think developers should give you the option to change up your desktop environment? You know, should you be able to pick what user interface you have, and how far do you customize your computer to make it how you want? So moving on to our final debate, after we've discussed all that, now we know that, you know, you can customize these, you can have them very personalized. Can you consider it as art? Now, there are a lot of things already that are considered as art, such as houses with architecture, cars, and clothes with the fashion industry. They have all been called a form of art, and they are all treated as a form of art. And in recent years, technology has really started to be used very artistically. If you look at many smartphone adverts now, you'll see that they are they're very much the same, but they're very artistic. They're very clean-cut, fancy animations, and are very intriguing. They seem very high class, if you know what I mean. It's almost as if the phone is now a model and it's swishing its hair about, and they show like the graphical user interface and how it works. The phone kind of very gently spins around and it slides to unlock, and it's all very elegantly done, and everything's all shiny and pristine, and it shows how thin they are. It tries to emphasize how thin these phones are and how elegant and smooth and beautiful they are. And I don't know, it seems artistic, but at the same time, it's still just a phone. It is just an inanimate object. It's any inanimate object. It's not got any real personability to it. But then again, this comes into the whole big can of worms, which is, what is art? Now, art is expression through limitation. So if we were look at it like that, you could say any single piece of code ever written could be considered as art. If you look at most code, there are rules and principles that it has to follow. It has to follow arguments. It has to follow structure and logic. If it doesn't, it falls apart and simply doesn't work. And if you follow these rules and you create something through these rules, through these limitations, and looks nice and people like it, I think you should be able to call it art. So if we were to look at it like that, another good way of explaining this is painting. Painting is painting. You use a paint and you use a paintbrush and you paint something on a canvas. That is painting. Okay, you might use paper, but most of the time you use a canvas, and that's painting. It is them materials. You can't, say, I'm going to do painting and then build a car made of metal. That isn't painting. You use paints and brushes to paint. In the same way, if you were to make a sculpture, you wouldn't use paint to paint a sculpture. You would physically make it out of physical things. Okay, you could use paint pots and paint brushes to make a sculpture, but you wouldn't use software or whatever to make a sculpture. Everything has its limitations. It's the same with music. You can't go, I'm going to make music and then it's a picture. That's not music. Music is heard. Music is a set of rules and structures. There are a finite amount of notes you can use in a scale, although you can change scale halfway through. Stuff like that. It's expression through limitation. It's how far you can express yourself through these limitations. And I think, up to some extent, phones and computers could be considered as a form of art. In fact, I've seen computers in art galleries. I've seen game consoles in art galleries. They have been, they were on show to show the history of technology. But I think they could. I mean, back in the day, everything was beige and dull and boring, but in itself, that's a product of its time. And that speaks so much about how we've come along in technology. And if you were to put that in a gallery, I don't see why you wouldn't put it in an art gallery, to be honest. It's a staple piece of history, in a way. And it's the same with modern technology, with our phones and the way our phones are designed. So much goes into the design now of a phone that it's simply uncanny. It's ridiculous. It's how much goes into modern architecture. It doesn't just have to be functional, it has to look elegant. Technology, I think, has become its own form of art in recent years, especially with how we're now adopting the GUI. I think GUIs aren't just going the way of this is how you should use your device and this is how we want you to use your device. I think it not only has to work, but it also has to look good. It has to be pleasant. It has to be fast, fluid, smooth, seamless, and gorgeous. It has to feel elegant and it has to be fun using it. So I think all these animations, all these icon packs, all these changes really tell a lot about how we're now using our technology. So I'm going to throw the question out to you. Would you consider gadgets as a form of art? Do you see smartphones as art? Would you hang a smartphone in an art gallery, or maybe do an art exhibition on the design of a graphical user interface or a computer? Let me know by tweeting us at TGITFH, or by following me on Facebook, or liking me on Facebook, or whatever you do on these social media platforms nowadays, over on facebook.com/theguy in the funny hat official. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll be back next week.